The honourable member for Coastal Bay Central Notre Dame.
Mr. Speaker, I am presenting this petition from my constituents and Canadians across the country who want an end to the vaccine mandates, especially for domestic travel, which is federally regulated. The petitioners note that several reviews and studies have revealed nearly non-existent transmission rates on airplanes. WestJet's chief medical officer said that there were no known records of transmission. Also, they note that countries around the world have removed their vaccine mandates and restrictions. Finally, petitioners state that the vaccine mandate imposed on Canadians taking domestic flights, trains and ferries is non-reasonable infringement on their rights and freedoms. The petitioners ask the government to abolish the domestic vaccine passport requirement for Canadian citizens and permanent residents taking domestic flights. And they ask for an end to all federally regulated COVID-19 vaccine mandates and restrictions. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Petition, the honourable member for Mission Masquerie Fraser Canyon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm presenting a petition on behalf of my constituent, the chief of the Chehalis First Nation. In 2006, Ralph Leon Jr. and 12 other individuals were charged after a 15-month investigation into alleged eagle poaching. This legal action languished in the courts for 9 years and included a mistrial, a fraud conviction against a senior conservation officer in charge of the investigation, calls from local Stalo leaders to drop the case, and accusations of highly unethical and disrespectful behavior on the part of the BC Conservation Officer Service. 3,422 days after charges were laid, Ralph Leon Jr. and other individuals were acquitted after Crown Counsel directed a stay in proceedings. Those wrongfully charged have gathered sufficient evidence showcasing A, conspiracy to prosecute innocent people, B, defamatory media release vilifying Indigenous peoples and cultures, C, fabrication of evidence and concealment of evidence including perjury, D, commission of fraud against the federal and provincial government, E, counseling and aiding Indigenous people to commit offences, F, trespassing on Indigenous reserved lands, G, conferring a corrupt benefit on a foreign official, and H, violating the privacy of Indigenous people on and off reserved lands, and continued denial of what happened to these Indigenous Canadians taints Canadian history and leads to mistrust in our institution and justice system. Therefore, the undersigned citizens of Canada call upon the Minister of Justice to conduct a public inquiry into the injustices committed by the BC Conservation Officer Service and the BC Prosecution Service against Chief Ralph Leon Jr. and the 12 other individuals because of their race and culture, with the express purpose of reconciling these injustices through a reversal of all convictions, return of property seized, and appropriate compensation. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Sherwood Park, Fort Saskatchewan.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I do have a number of petitions to present today. I'm not sure the exact number, but I appreciate this opportunity. Mr. Speaker, the first petition deals with a commitment that was in the Liberals' 2021 election platform. It was a commitment to essentially politicize the application of charitable status. And petitioners, including a broad range of stakeholders, are opposed to the politicization of charitable status, the adding of another values test to the charitable status test. Petitioners expressed concern that a similar effort was made with respect to the Canada Summer Jobs program. They don't want to see that happen again. They call on the government to protect and preserve the application of charitable status rules on a politically and ideologically neutral basis without the discrimination on the basis of political or religious values, without the imposition of another values test, and to affirm the rights of Canadians to protection in terms of their freedom of expression. Mr. Speaker, the next petition I am tabling is in support of Bill S-233, a bill that will be debated on Friday. It is a bill that would make it a criminal offense for a person to go abroad and receive an organ taken without consent. It would also create a mechanism by which someone could be deemed inadmissible to Canada if they are involved in forced organ harvesting and trafficking. Bills on this issue have been before the House for about 15 years. They've always had broad support, but never made it all the way. Petitioners are hopeful that this Parliament will be the one that finally gets it done. Mr. Speaker, on a similar vein, this is a petition that highlights the persecution of Falun Gong practitioners, in particular in China. They note that it's been decades since the Chinese Communist regime began their campaign attempting to eradicate Falun Gong, a spiritual practice that simply centers on advancing the idea of truthfulness, compassion, and forbearance. Many resolutions have been adopted in parliaments around the world, and it's relevant to the previous petition because we know that Falun Gong practitioners, as well as Uyghurs and others in China, have been victims of forced organ harvesting and trafficking. Petitioners urge the government and parliament to establish measures to stop the murder of Falun Gong practitioners, including to stop organ harvesting and trafficking, to take every opportunity to call for an end to the persecution of Falun Gong practitioners, and also the petitioner calls on the Chinese leaders to bring former leader Jiang Zemin and his cohorts to justice for their involvement in what took place. Mr. Speaker, the next petition I'm tabling highlights the human rights situation in the Tigray region of Ethiopia. Petitioners are very concerned about ongoing conflict as well as the humanitarian challenges that have been unfolding, and they call for greater engagement by the Government of Canada in the context of this situation. And they want to see the government engaging with the government of Ethiopia as well as the neighboring government of Eritrea, and encourage them to not be fomented.
All right, I know there's a lot of pent-up demand today, so I'm just reminding the member that there's even members of his own caucus that like to present some petitions. The honourable member for Sherwood Park, Fort Saskatchewan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. They normally call me last, so I thought I was the only one when you called me. So. All right. Well, maybe I'll table one more for now then, and if members agree, I will return at the end of other members. But for now then, I will table one more petition respecting Bill C-257. It's a private member's bill that I've also put forward in this House, recognizing concerns about increasing political discrimination against Canadians on the basis of their political views. This bill would seek to add political belief and activity as prohibited grounds of discrimination in the Canadian Human Rights Act. So petitioners are calling on the House to support Bill C-257, which bans this discrimination, and certainly to defend the rights of Canadians to peacefully express their political opinions. Thank you.
I really appreciate this to the member for Sherwood Park, Fort Saskatchewan. I'm going to go try to through the parties before I get back. Presenting petitions, Petition, the honourable member for Battle River, Crowfoot.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to present a petition signed by a host of Canadians that have expressed grave concern about how the Liberals are willing to politicize things like charitable status within this country. Mr. Speaker, these petitioners from across Canada call upon the House of Commons to, one, protect and preserve the application of charitable status rules on a politically and ideologically neutral basis without discrimination on the basis of political or religious values without the imposition of another, quote, values test, and two, affirm the right of Canadians to freedom of expression in Canada. Mr. Speaker, it is an honour to be able to stand with these Canadians and present this petition in the House today.
President Petition, presenting the positions, the honourable member for, I know I always get this one, Peace River, Westlock.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise to present a number of petitions today from hundreds of Canadians across Canada, including my own constituents. The petitioners are concerned about the accessibility and impact of violent, degrading, sexually explicit material online and the impacts on public health, especially on the well-being of women and girls. They recognize that we cannot say that we believe in preventing sexual violence towards women while allowing pornography companies to freely expose our children to violent, sexually explicit imagery day after day, which is a form of child abuse. As such, they note that the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child requires Canada to develop the means to protect children from forms of media that are injurious to their well-being. As such, the petitioners are calling on the House of Commons to require meaningful age verification on all adult websites. My next petition, Mr. Speaker, is from folks in my riding that live in the towns of Fox Creek and Swan Hills. These two towns are in northern Alberta, and the petitioner is saying that the rising heat costs and other expenses of life make life more expensive in these communities. They also have to travel great distances to access groceries and shopping centres. The petitioners state that there's an arbitrary line that runs across Alberta, preventing Fox Creek and Swan Hills residents from accessing the northern residents' living allowance. The petitioners are asking that the government include Fox Creek and Scrawn Hills as communities within the prescribed intermediate zone and allow these people to receive the Northern Living Allowance for living in Northern Alberta. The next petition I am presenting today, Mr. Speaker, is from folks from across Canada who are concerned that certain charities could be targeted based on their views and forced into a values test. The petitioners note that the Liberals have promised to deny charitable status to groups that they view as being dishonest. This could jeopardize the charitable status of hospitals, houses of worship, schools, homeless shelters, and other organizations. We've seen a similar values test applied to the Canada Summer Jobs Grant. The petitioners are asking the House of Commons to protect and preserve the application of charitable status rules on a politically and ideologically neutral basis, without discrimination on the basis of political or religious views, and without the imposition of another values test. They also ask for an affirmation of the freedom of expression for all Canadians. The next petition I am presenting today, Mr. Speaker, is from Canadians from across the country who are concerned about the impact of sexually explicit material, including demeaning and violent material on the internet. These folks are worried about the consumption of the sexually explicit material by young persons ranging with a range of harms and the development of gender stereotypes and the development of harassment and violence and sexual harassment and sexual violence, particularly against women. They are calling on the Government of Canada to enact meaningful age verification. There was a recommendation that was brought forward by the Committee of Health in 2017, and therefore they are calling for this House to adopt Bill S-210, the Protection of Young Persons from the Exposure to Pornography Act. My final petition today, Madam Chair, is from petitioners from across the country who want an end to the vaccine mandates, especially for domestic travel, which is federally regulated. The petitioners are calling, note that several reviews and studies have revealed that there's non-existent transmission rates on airplanes. Finally, the petitioners state that the vaccine mandates imposed on Canadians taking domestic flights, trains, and ferries is an unreasonable infringement on their rights and freedoms. They are asking for an end to all federally regulated COVID-19 vaccine mandates and restrictions. Thank you, Madam Chair.